Steve Harvey asked a simple Family Feud question to a middle-aged woman in the audience, expecting a lighthearted answer. But when she spoke 3 words, "My son would've," the entire studio froze. What happened next broke every game show rule and made millions of people believe in the power of human compassion again. It was Thursday, September 7th, 2023, at the Family Feud studio in Atlanta, Georgia. The energy was exactly what you'd expect. Loud, competitive, and filled with Steve Harvey's signature humor. The Martinez family from Dallas was facing off against the Chun family from San Francisco, and both teams were bringing their A-game. The audience was fully engaged, laughing at Steve's reactions and cheering for their favorite family. But in the middle of the second round, something happened that no one saw coming. Steve had just finished delivering one of his famous reactions to an unexpected answer when he decided to do something he occasionally did during tapings: engage directly with the audience. He walked toward the front rows, microphone in hand, his trademark grin lighting up the stage. All right, Steve said, his voice booming through the studio. "Let me ask y'all something while we're waiting for the next round." He scanned the audience, looking for someone to interact with. His eyes landed on a woman sitting in the third row, center section. She was in her early 50s, wearing a simple navy blue cardigan and glasses. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and she had a soft, gentle smile on her face, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. There was something about her quiet presence that drew Steve's attention. "Ma'am," Steve said, pointing at her with a smile. "Yes, you in the blue. What's your name?" The woman looked surprised, glancing at the people around her, as if to make sure Steve was really talking to her. She stood up slowly, her smile widening just a bit. "My name is Ann," she said, her voice clear but soft. "And Patterson. And Patterson," Steve repeated with enthusiasm. "Where you from, Ann?" "I'm from Richmond, Virginia," Ann replied. "Richmond. All right, Steve said, nodding approvingly. "And let me ask you something. We just had a question on the board. Name something a parent does every day for their child. Now, you look like you might be a mama. Am I right?" Ann's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, so quick that most people in the studio didn't notice. But Steve Harvey had been reading audiences for over 3 decades. He saw it. "Yes," and said quietly. "Yes, I am." Okay, Steve continued, unaware of what was about to unfold. "So what's something you do every day for your child?" And looked down at her hands, then back up at Steve. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but there was a weight to it that hadn't been there before. "I visit his grave," she said simply. The studio fell silent. Steve Harvey stopped mid-gesture. His smile disappeared. The audience, which had been buzzing with energy just moments before, was now completely still. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze. And continued, her voice growing softer. "Every morning before I go to work, I stop by the cemetery and I tell him about my day. I tell him what I'm going to do, who I'm going to see, what I'm making for dinner. I tell him I love him, and I tell him I'm sorry I couldn't save him." Steve Harvey, a man who had built a career on quick wit and perfect timing, was completely speechless. Ann's eyes filled with tears, but she kept talking. His name was Daniel. He was 17 years old. He died in a car accident 3 years ago. He was coming home from basketball practice, and a drunk driver ran a red light. The silence in the studio was deafening. Several people in the audience were openly crying. The Martinez and Chun families, standing at their respective podiums, had stopped celebrating. They were just watching, their faces full of compassion and sorrow. Steve walked closer to Ann, his microphone hanging loosely at his side. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, stripped of all performance. And he said quietly, "I'm so sorry," and nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Thank you, Mr. Harvey. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bring the mood down. When you ask what I do every day for my child, that's the truth. That's what I do." Steve Harvey did something unprecedented. He set his microphone down on the floor, walked directly to Ann, and wrapped his arms around her in a tight, genuine hug. The cameras kept rolling, but this was no longer television. This was humanity at its most raw. The studio audience watched in silence, many of them wiping their own tears. After a long moment, Steve pulled back and looked Ann in the eyes. "You didn't bring the mood down," he said firmly. "You just reminded all of us what real love looks like." Steve picked up his microphone and turned to address the entire studio. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "this is Ann Patterson, and she just showed us something that's more important than any game show. She showed us that love doesn't stop when someone dies. It doesn't stop when your heart is broken. It doesn't stop, period." The audience began to applaud, softly at first, then growing louder. But it wasn't the usual game show applause. It was respectful, emotional, and deeply human. Steve turned back to Ann. "Can I ask you something, Ann? And you don't have to answer if you don't want to." And nodded. "What was Daniel like?" Steve asked. Ann's face lit up for the first time since she'd started speaking. "He was kind," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "He was so kind. He wanted to be a teacher. He loved kids. He volunteered at the Boys and Girls Club every weekend, coaching basketball for elementary school kids. He was funny and smart, and he had this laugh, this big, loud laugh that would just fill up a room." Steve smiled gently. "He sounds like he was an incredible young man. He was," and whispered, "he was everything." Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Steve Harvey made a decision in that moment that would define not just that episode, but his entire legacy as a host. He looked over at the production team in the booth and made a gesture that every crew member understood. "Stop the game." The producers looked confused, but Steve's authority on his own show was absolute. He turned back to the audience. "You know what?" Steve said. "We're going to take a break from Family Feud for a minute, because sometimes something more important than a game show is happening right here in this room." He walked back to Ann, who was still standing in the third row, tears streaming down her face. "And I want you to know something," Steve said. "Your son may not be here physically, but he's alive in you. He's alive in every word you speak about him. He's alive in every morning you visit him. And he's alive in the way you're standing here right now, being brave enough to share his story with all these people." And broke down completely. Steve helped her sit down and knelt beside her seat. "Can I tell you what I see when I look at you?" Steve asked gently, and nodded, unable to speak. "I see a mama who loves her son so much that she makes sure he's never forgotten," Steve said. "I see strength. I see courage. I see the kind of love that most people will never understand unless they've lost someone the way you have." Steve paused, gathering his thoughts. "And I lost my father when I was young," he continued. "And I remember my mama doing exactly what you're doing. She talked to him. She kept him alive in our house. And you know what? That's not sad. That's beautiful. That's what love looks like when it refuses to die." The studio was completely silent except for the sound of people crying. Even the hardened television crew members, who had seen countless emotional moments over the years, were visibly moved. Steve stood up and addressed the audience again. "How many of you have lost someone you love?" he asked. Hands went up throughout the studio. Nearly 3/4 of the audience was raising their hands. "That's what I thought," Steve said. "And you're not alone in this. Not even close." He turned back to Ann. "I want to do something for you. I want to honor Daniel's memory in a way that I think he would have loved." Steve walked over to the production team and spoke quietly with them for a moment. When he returned to the stage, he had tears in his own eyes. "And," Steve said, "I just found out that the Boys and Girls Club, where Daniel volunteered, is still active. Is that right?" And nodded. "Yes, they have a basketball court named after him now. The Daniel Patterson Memorial Court." Steve's face broke into a smile. "That's beautiful. And I want to make a donation to that Boys and Girls Club in Daniel's name. $50,000 to support their basketball programs and help kids the way your son did." The audience erupted in applause and covered her face with her hands, sobbing. But Steve wasn't finished. And he continued, "I want you to come back to this show in a few months. I want you to bring Daniel's friends, his coaches, the kids he mentored. I want them to tell us about the Daniel Patterson they knew, because that young man's story deserves to be told." And stood up and hugged Steve again, holding on tight, like she was afraid to let go. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for letting me talk about my son. No, And Steve said, "Thank you for reminding all of us what really matters." Behind the scenes, Steve made another decision that defied every producer's expectation. He walked over to both the Martinez and Chun families and spoke to them quietly. Moments later, both families left their podiums and walked over to Anne. One by one, they hugged her. The Martinez family's grandmother, a woman in her 70s, held Anne's hands and whispered something in her ear that made Anne smile through her tears. The Chun family's teenage daughter gave Anne her phone number and asked if she could volunteer at the Boys and Girls Club in Daniel's honor. What happened next was pure magic. Steve returned to the game, but the energy had completely shifted. This was no longer about winning or losing. It was about community, connection, and the shared human experience of love and loss. When the episode finally aired 6 weeks later, the response was immediate and overwhelming. The clip of Anne's story and Steve's response was shared over 150 million times across all social media platforms within the first 72 hours. But the real magic happened in the comments and messages that flooded Family Feud's social media accounts. "I lost my daughter 5 years ago, and I thought I was crazy for still talking to her every day. And story made me realize I'm not alone. Steve Harvey reminded me that grief isn't something to hide. It's something to honor. I've been too afraid to talk about my son who died. But watching him be so brave made me realize that keeping his memory alive is the most important thing I can do." 3 months later, Ann Patterson returned to Family Feud for a special episode dedicated to Daniel's memory. She brought with her Daniel's best friend, his basketball coach, and 3 kids he had mentored at the Boys and Girls Club. When Ann walked on a stage, she received a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Steve greeted her with open arms, and this time, Ann was smiling, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "And how are you doing?" Steve asked during the introduction. "I'm doing okay, Mr. Harvey," Ann replied. "Some days are harder than others, but I'm okay." "And when you were here last time, you told us about visiting Daniel's grave every morning," Steve said. "Are you still doing that?" "Every single day," Ann said firmly. "And now I have something new to tell him. I tell him about all the people who reached out to me after our episode aired. I tell him about the hundreds of parents who said that my story helped them. I tell him that his life mattered, and that his legacy is still helping kids 3 years after he's gone." The audience applauded warmly. Steve turned to Daniel's best friend, Marcus, who was standing next to Ann. "Marcus, tell us about Daniel," Steve said. Marcus, a tall young man in his early 20s, stepped forward. "Daniel was my brother in every way that mattered," he said. "He was the kind of person who would give you the shirt off his back. He was the first person to show up when you needed help, and the last person to leave. He made everyone around him better." Daniel's basketball coach, Coach Williams, spoke next. "Daniel had a gift for connecting with kids," he said. "He saw potential in every child, especially the ones who struggled. He believed in them when no one else did. And because of that, dozens of kids stayed in school, stayed out of trouble, and found their path in life." But the most powerful moment came when a 14-year-old boy named Jamal stepped forward. Jamal had been one of the kids Daniel mentored at the Boys and Girls Club. "Daniel saved my life," Jamal said quietly. "I was heading down a bad path. I was angry, I was getting into fights, I was failing school. But Daniel never gave up on me. He showed up every single week, and he told me I was worth something. He made me believe I could be more than what people expected." Jamal looked directly at Ann. "Ms. Ann, I want you to know that because of your son, I'm going to college next year. I got a scholarship to play basketball and study education. And when I become a teacher, it's going to be because Daniel showed me what it means to care about kids," and broke down crying. But this time they were tears of joy and pride. Steve Harvey, who had been holding it together throughout the entire segment, finally let his own tears fall. "This," Steve said, his voice breaking, "this is what legacy looks like. Daniel Patterson may not be here physically, but he's alive in Jamal. He's alive in every kid he mentored. He's alive in his mama, who refuses to let his memory fade. And he's alive in all of us who heard his story and were changed by it. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten." The episode featuring Daniel's memorial became the highest-rated Family Feud episode in the show's history. But more importantly, it inspired the creation of the Daniel Patterson Memorial Fund, a scholarship program for underprivileged youth interested in education and coaching. Steve Harvey became the fund's first major donor and serves on its board of directors. To date, the fund has provided over $2 million in scholarships to students across the country. And Patterson's moment on Family Feud became more than just a viral video. It became a movement, a reminder that grief and love are two sides of the same coin, and that honoring the dead means living fully in their memory. Steve Harvey has said in interviews that In Story changed him as a host and as a person, and taught me that my job isn't to avoid difficult moments, Steve said. My job is to create space for real human connection. And sometimes it means stopping the game and just being present for someone who's hurting. Today, Ann Patterson continues to visit Daniel's grave every morning. But now, she brings with her letters from people around the world who were touched by her story. She reads them to Daniel, telling him about the lives he's still changing. The video of Ann's appearance on Family Feud has been viewed over 250 million times across all platforms. But the real victory isn't in the view count. It's in the thousands of parents who no longer feel alone in their grief. It's in the kids who found hope in Daniel's story. It's in the reminder that love, real love, never dies. It just changes form. Steve Harvey asked a simple audience question that day, expecting a simple answer. What he got instead was a masterclass in courage, a demonstration of enduring love, and a reminder that sometimes the most important moments in television happen when you forget about the cameras and just focus on being human. And Patterson went to Family Feud hoping to enjoy a fun afternoon. Instead, she shared her deepest pain on national television and created a legacy that continues to heal broken hearts around the world. And Steve Harvey learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is simply this: to see their pain, acknowledge their love, and remind them that they are not alone. Tonight, somewhere in Richmond, Virginia, and Patterson will wake up early and drive to the cemetery. She'll stand at Daniel's grave and tell him about her day, about the people she'll see, about what she's making for dinner. She'll tell him about the latest scholarship recipient, a young woman who wants to be a teacher just like Daniel dreamed of being. And she'll tell him, as she does every morning, that she loves him, that she's proud of him, and that his life mattered more than words could ever express. Because love doesn't stop when someone dies. It doesn't stop when your heart is broken. It doesn't stop, period. And that's the legacy of Daniel Patterson, a 17-year-old boy whose life was cut tragically short, but whose impact continues to ripple outward, touching lives, healing hearts, and reminding all of us what it really means to live with purpose. If this incredible story of love, loss, and enduring legacy moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that grief is just love with nowhere to go, and that honoring those we've lost is one of the most beautiful things we can do. Have you ever lost someone whose memory still guides you every day? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing true stories about the power of love and the strength of the human spirit.